4 a.m. in January 1943. Temperature 7 degrees below zero. The light inside isn't warm, it's industrial white, a mile-long fluorescent tunnel that hums like a hive. Steam rises from the bodies of 42,000 people working shoulder to shoulder, their breath mixing with the smell of aviation fuel and hot metal. Somewhere in this concrete canyon, a B-24 Liberator bomber rolls off the assembly line every 63 minutes. 4 aluminum wings span wider than most houses. 11 men will fly it. Some won't come back. The foreman told the new hires yesterday that if they couldn't handle the pace, Detroit was that way. Most of them had no money for the bus. What you're looking at isn't just a factory. It's a city built on the promise that sacrifice wins war. Henry Ford believed he could turn airplanes into automobiles, mass-produce them with the same ruthless efficiency that made him America's richest industrialist. The government believed him enough to write a check for $200 million. 42,000 workers believed the promise of steady pay until they saw the dormitories. The question nobody asked until it was too late: who pays when the promise breaks? Was this the arsenal of democracy or the assembly line of disposable labor? When President Roosevelt went on the radio in May 1940, his voice carried the weight of a world already burning. Poland had fallen. France would follow in weeks. Britain stood alone. America had 32 tanks, 32. Germany deployed 6,000 in the Battle of France. The United States had 54 heavy bombers, while the Luftwaffe blackened European skies. America's Air Force ranked 18th in the world, behind Portugal. The math was simple and terrifying. Roosevelt needed 50,000 combat aircraft within 12 months. The aircraft industry, still handcrafting planes in California and Connecticut, could barely deliver 5,000. What came next wasn't a request. It was conscription by another name. He summoned the automotive industry because they had what the aircraft manufacturers didn't: assembly lines that moved faster than human hands could. William Knudsen, the Danish immigrant who'd clawed his way to GM's presidency, resigned within weeks to chair the Office of Production Management. In October 1940, he gathered the heads of Studebaker, Nash Motors, Hudson, and GM in a New York hotel room. The message was blunt. America needed bombers, more than it could hope for and sooner than it dared to ask for. The automakers said they could make all the pieces. What they couldn't say yet was whether they could make them work together. The focus landed on the B-24 Liberator. Consolidated Aircraft had designed it in San Diego, a twin-tailed beast with 2 bomb bays and tricycle landing gear, capable of flying higher, farther, and carrying more destruction than anything else in the air. It was also the most problematic airplane the Army had on its list. Hand-built by craftsmen who adjusted every rivet to fit, it couldn't survive the automotive method. Too many parts, too many sizes, too many chances for something to go wrong at altitude. Charles Sorensen, Ford's vice president of production, flew to San Diego in January 1941 with Edsel Ford. Sorensen watched Consolidated's workers hand-fit wing sections and fuselage panels like tailors. That night in his hotel room, Sorensen couldn't sleep. He sketched the outline of a factory on hotel stationery. Not a facility to make parts for someone else to assemble. A factory to build complete bombers, start to finish, one every hour. He showed Edsel the drawing at breakfast. Edsel looked at the numbers and said Ford Motor Company would build it. At their meeting with Major Reuben Fleet, Consolidated's founder, Sorensen unrolled his napkin sketch and declared Ford would produce a finished B-24 every 60 minutes. Fleet thought he was insane. Then Sorensen named a price: $200 million. The government would pay, Ford would deliver. Albert Kahn, the industrial architect who'd already designed 800 factories for Ford, translated Sorensen's fever dream into concrete and steel, 3.5 million square feet, an L-shaped building because Henry Ford refused to negotiate easements with neighboring landowners in Wayne County, where taxes ran higher. The assembly line would stretch over a mile with a 90-degree turn 2/3 of the way through, requiring 4 massive turntables to rotate half-finished bombers mid-assembly. The east end of the building sat 5 feet lower than the west, a deliberate slope to let gravity assist the planes rolling toward final assembly. Construction broke ground in April 1941. $47 million, and 6 months later, the building was ready. The workforce wasn't. Training began in summer 1941, while the building still smelled like wet concrete. The Aircraft Apprentice School cycled 8,000 students per week through crash courses on riveting, wiring, hydraulics, and aluminum skin work. Most had never touched an airplane. Many couldn't read blueprints. The pressure was biblical. War was no longer theoretical. Pearl Harbor turned December 7, 1941, into a deadline written in smoke. On October 1, 1942, the first completed B-24 rolled out of the hangar door. They christened it the Spirit of Ypsilanti. It was 4 months behind schedule, and the workers knew Ford's patience had limits thinner than aluminum skin. The problems multiplied faster than solutions. Ford's engineers were used to stamping car bodies from steel dies. Steel was forgiving. You could hammer out mistakes, weld corrections, force tolerances. Aluminum wasn't steel. It cracked under pressure, warped in heat, demanded precision measured in thousandths of an inch. Every design change from consolidated meant retooling dies, recalibrating machines, retraining workers. Ford had mastered interchangeable parts for Model Ts. A B-24 had 450,000 parts and 360,000 rivets in 550 sizes. There was nothing interchangeable about an airplane that had to hold pressure at 25,000 feet. Quality control became warfare by another name. Inspectors walked the line with rejection stamps, marking substandard work that had to be torn out and redone. A rejected rivet meant 15 minutes lost. A rejected wing section meant hours. A rejected fuselage meant shifts. Workers learned quickly that rejection cost more than time. It cost reputation, assignment priority, sometimes employment. The pressure to pass inspection the first time was brutal. Absenteeism ran wild in the first year. Workers signed on in Detroit, took the bus out to Ypsilanti, saw the dormitories, and caught the next bus back. The numbers were stark enough that Ford's personnel department stopped reporting them internally. In 1 month alone, Ford hired 2,900 workers and lost 3,100. The net was negative 200, which meant the workforce was shrinking while production targets climbed. The commute from Detroit took an hour each way on roads not built for war traffic. Michigan Avenue was 2 lanes of patched asphalt that turned to mud in spring and ice in winter. Gas rationing started in May 1942, limiting civilian drivers to 3 gallons per week. Tire rationing followed because rubber came from Southeast Asia, and Southeast Asia was under Japanese control. Men who'd driven to work suddenly had no legal way to get there. Carpools formed, then collapsed when someone's shift changed or someone quit. The factory ran 2 9-hour shifts, and workers who missed their ride home slept on floors, in break rooms, in cars parked in the lot, anywhere horizontal. Housing became the bottleneck that almost strangled production. Ypsilanti Township in 1940 was farmland, a place where cows outnumbered people, and the biggest employer was a grain elevator that processed winter wheat. The township population was 3,700, spread across farms and a small downtown commercial district. When Ford announced Willow Run, the population projections jumped to 50,000 almost overnight. The township couldn't absorb that growth any more than a creek could absorb a river. There was no infrastructure, no water mains, no sewer system scaled for industrial use, no housing stock beyond farmhouses, and a few boarding houses in town. People improvised with the desperation of those who had no alternative. They rented rooms in Ann Arbor, paying landlords who tripled rents overnight because demand obliterated supply, and there was no rent control to stop it. They commuted from Grosse Pointe, 100 miles round trip, burning gas they couldn't replace and tires they couldn't buy. They slept in cars when the weather allowed, which wasn't often in Michigan winter. They pitched tents in fields until November frost made that impossible. Some built shacks from scrap lumber and tar paper on land they didn't own. Some shared beds in shifts, hot bunking like sailors, where one worker slept while another worked. Then they switched. Landlords in Ypsilanti and surrounding townships recognized opportunity when 40,000 desperate workers arrived simultaneously. A spare bedroom that had rented for $15 a month in 1940 went for $50 by 1940. Attics became apartments, basements became dormitories. Barns became boarding houses. Some landlords installed triple bunk beds in single rooms, charging $15 per bed per month. 9 people in a room designed for 1. The federal government stepped in because Ford wouldn't. Henry Ford believed housing was a worker's personal right, not an employer's obligation. By 1942, Ford's position was ideological. If the government wanted bombers, the government could house the workers. The Federal Public Housing Administration poured $20 million into emergency construction. That number was larger than the entire annual budget of most Michigan counties. The money moved fast, because the alternative was losing the war in 1943 instead of winning it in 1945. They broke ground on Willow Run Lodge in late 1942, a complex of 15 dormitory buildings on land immediately adjacent to the factory. The buildings were utilitarian, wood-frame construction with tar paper siding, designed to last 5 years if maintenance was perfect. The dorms contained 1,900 rooms, some single occupancy, some double. The rooms were small, 8 feet by 10 feet for singles, 10 by 12 for doubles. A bed, a dresser, a chair. No closet because closets took space. Communal bathrooms down the hall. Communal kitchens in each building. No private cooking, no private anything. The dormitories opened in February 1943, and the line of workers waiting for keys stretched half a mile into the Michigan cold. They'd been sleeping in cars and barns for months, sometimes years. A bed with heat and running water looked like luxury. 3 months later, Willow Run Village opened with 2,500 family housing units. They were flat-roofed, single-story structures, arranged in rows like military barracks. The units came in 3 sizes: 1-bedroom, 2-bedroom, 3-bedroom. The square footage was minimal. A 2-bedroom unit had 600 square feet total. That's smaller than a modern hotel suite, divided into living room, kitchen, 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom. Families of 4 and 5 and 6 crammed into spaces that were temporary by design and permanent by necessity. Construction continued through 1940. Another 1,000 family units. Another trailer park for workers who brought their own trailers. Another dormitory complex with 1,960 more rooms. This one segregated by race because federal housing policy mandated segregation in all federally funded projects. Black workers lived in separate buildings, used separate facilities, waited in separate lines. The policy was law until activists forced change. By 1944, Willow Run Village housed 18,000 people across 8,800 units on 2,600 acres. It was the second largest housing project in America, exceeded only by a public housing complex in New York. People called it Bomber City, and the name stuck because it captured something essential about the place. It wasn't a town, it wasn't a neighborhood. It was a city built overnight to serve a single purpose: keep workers close enough to the factory that they could walk there if necessary. The village had 30 dormitories, 6 community buildings, rows of small houses, commercial buildings, police and fire stations, schools. It had everything a real city had except permanence. Everyone knew it was temporary. The buildings were temporary. The jobs were temporary. The war would end, and then Bomber City would disappear. Henry Ford hated unions, hated women working in factories. He believed women distracted men, softened discipline. When the draft pulled men out of Detroit, Ford resisted hiring women until the numbers made resistance suicide. The women came anyway, 12,000 of them by 1944. Ford paid them 85 cents an hour, same as men. He also mandated they wear denim coveralls purchased at their own expense while men wore street clothes. On August 15, 1942, 26 women showed up in street clothes. Ford sent them home without pay. Louise Stabler, a UAW militant and single mother, organized a wildcat strike. Production stopped for 4 hours. Ford relented. The women won because stopping production cost more than letting them dress themselves. Wildcat strikes erupted weekly, despite the UAW's no-strike pledge. Workers who organized strikes found themselves transferred to the worst stations, riveting gun turrets in cramped spaces, breathing aluminum dust and solvent fumes. The turnover was brutal because Ford could afford it, until the supply of replacement workers dried up. Ford started recruiting from the South with promises of good wages and steady work. Thousands migrated north to find housing shortages worse than advertised and racial segregation enforced by federal policy. Black families who'd left the South to escape Jim Crow found segregated housing, segregated schools, segregated bathrooms inside the factory itself. Reverend Henry G. Simmons of Brown Chapel AME Church organized pickets demanding black women be hired at equal rates. He picketed segregated housing developments. He traveled to Washington with Thurgood Marshall to argue for desegregation of war industry. In 1943, the government authorized Park Ridge Homes, an 80-unit integrated housing complex. A token compared to thousands of segregated units, but progress measured by what was possible. The accidents happened with the frequency of shift changes. Pneumatic tools misfired. Fuselage panels crushed workers. Workers fell from scaffolds. Ford didn't publish accident statistics. Union organizers counted dozens injured weekly. Workers who filed compensation claims found themselves terminated for unrelated infractions. The message was clear: accept the risk or leave. Sorensen walked the line daily with a stopwatch. Every second wasted was a dead soldier somewhere. The propaganda saturated the plant. Someone talked posters. When you ride alone, you ride with Hitler. If you slow down, you kill Americans. If you quit, you're worse than the enemy. Let's pause on the numbers. 3.5 million square feet under one roof, larger than the Pentagon, a mile-long assembly line with a 90-degree turn requiring 4 turntables, each 60 feet in diameter, 67 feet long, nose to tail. Wingspan 110 feet, 18 tons empty, 4 engines, 1,200 horsepower each. Range 2,100 miles with 8,000 pounds of bombs, 10 50-caliber machine guns, 11 crew members. At peak production in April 1944, Ford rolled out 428 bombers, one every 63 minutes around the clock. Between April 24th and 26, 100 completed B-24s flew off the runway in 3 days. The Army asked Ford to slow down. They had nowhere to park the planes. Pilots slept on 1,300 cots, waiting for bombers that arrived faster than crews could be trained. By 1945, Ford produced 70% of all B-24s in 2 9-hour shifts. Total production: 8,685 aircraft, 6,972 complete planes, 1,893 knockdown kits, 92 million pounds of airplanes. The B-24 Liberator became the most produced heavy bomber in history. Behind the propaganda, the human cost accumulated. Workers recruited from the South found themselves trapped in Bomber City with no money for bus fare home. Segregation followed them north. Accidents happened constantly. The pressure to maintain pace was industrial religion backed by patriotic fervor. Workers who made mistakes that caused defects felt personally responsible for failures in combat. 50,000 B-24 crew members died during the war. The workers who built those planes knew it. Germany surrendered May 7, 1945. Ford received termination orders 3 weeks later. The last B-24 rolled off the line June 28, 1945. 7,400 workers remained, down from 42,000 at peak. By September, Willow Run employed fewer than 1,000. Henry Ford II called the plant as expendable as a battleship. Workers who'd migrated from the South with promises of steady employment now had no job, no bus fare home, no way to pay rent. The government sold the factory to Kaiser Frazer. Former bomber workers lost seniority rights in rehiring. Kaiser Frazer took over in 1947, producing cars on the same line that had churned out bombers. They built 739,000 cars between 1947 and 1953. It wasn't enough. They moved to Toledo. Willow Run sat empty. On August 12, 1953, GM's Detroit transmission plant in Livonia burned to the ground. The fire started in the early morning shift, origin unknown, and spread through the wooden roof supports before anyone could contain it. By noon, the building was total loss. By evening, GM executives were calculating whether to rebuild or relocate. Rebuilding would take 18 months. Relocating would be faster if they could find a facility large enough. Willow Run was available, massive, and equipped with infrastructure designed for heavy manufacturing. More importantly, it was empty and desperate. Kaiser Frazer was gone. The county needed the tax revenue. The workers needed jobs. GM needed production capacity. The deal closed within days. 400 specialists moved the transmission operation from the ashes of Livonia to the intact shell of Willow Run in 12 weeks. The plant reopened as GM Hydramatic in late 1953, producing automatic transmissions for Chevrolet, Pontiac, Oldsmobile, Buick. By the 1960s, automatic transmissions outsold manuals in American cars, and Willow Run was producing millions of units annually. During the Vietnam War, the plant pivoted to military production again, manufacturing M16 rifles and aircraft cannons under government contract. Workers assembled the rifles on the same floor where they'd built transmissions, then switched back when the contracts expired. The flexibility was economic. The plant could pivot to whatever generated revenue. In the 1970s, Willow Run employed 14,000 workers at peak capacity. To manage parking for that many workers, GM staggered departures in 6-minute increments, a logistical dance where each shift cohort was released in waves to prevent gridlock. The parking lots covered more acreage than some Michigan towns. Workers walked a quarter-mile from their cars to the plant entrance. The wages were union wages, which meant they covered mortgages and car payments and college tuition if you worked overtime. Benefits included health insurance, pension contributions, paid vacation. It wasn't wealth, but it was stability. That stability ended slowly, then all at once. The 1980s brought automation, robotics, and offshore competition that undercut American labor costs. GM responded by reducing headcount year over year, replacing workers with machines that didn't take breaks or file grievances. Employment dropped from 14,000 in the 1970s to 8,000 in the 1990s to 4,000 by 2005. The plant modernized in 2005, a $200 million renovation that upgraded 1 million square feet to produce 6-speed automatic transmissions. The investment was supposed to secure the plant's future for another 20 years. It lasted 4. General Motors filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy June 1, 2009. The filing listed assets of $82 billion and debts of $173 billion. The gap between what GM owned and what GM owed was larger than the GDP of most countries. Willow Run powertrain plant employed 1,364 workers when GM announced closure as part of the bankruptcy reorganization. The announcement came without warning and without alternatives. The plant would close, the workers would be laid off, the building would be abandoned. The timeline was non-negotiable. The plant continued operating through December 2010 under bankruptcy supervision. The last transmission rolled off the line December 23, 2010, 3 days before Christmas. The workers walked out on December 28th. Some had been there since the 1970s, 40 years of building transmissions in the same building where their fathers and grandfathers had built bombers. They left with severance packages negotiated by the UAW, pension benefits that would be reduced in bankruptcy court, and the knowledge that the skills they'd spent decades refining were obsolete. The government auctioned the plant's equipment in early 2011. Precision machining tools, hydraulic presses, assembly robots, all of it sold to the highest bidder and shipped elsewhere. The building sat empty, waiting. What GM left behind was worse than abandonment. Underneath 5 million square feet of concrete and steel, beneath decades of transmission oil and industrial solvents, the groundwater carried contamination that nobody had publicized and few people. Light, non-aqueous phase liquids, the technical term for oil-like substances that don't mix with water. Trichloroethylene, a degreaser used to clean metal parts before assembly. Benzene, toluene, xylene, solvents used in manufacturing processes that nobody questioned when the plant was running. The solvents soaked through floors when spills happened, pooled in sumps and pits designed to collect them, then leaked through joints and cracks into the soil below. GM first detected the contamination in the 1980s. Internal environmental audits found oil accumulating under portions of the building. Recovery systems were installed in the 1980s and 1990s to pump contaminated groundwater out, treat it, and discharge it. The systems worked, partially. They captured some of the contamination, but not all. The geology didn't cooperate. Clay soils held water in unpredictable ways, channeling contamination through layers of sand and gravel. In 2002, GM assessed the recovery systems and made repairs to various wells. Many wells were decommissioned and removed in subsequent years. The remaining recovery systems were decommissioned before demolition in 2013. The contamination remained. 4.1 million gallons of industrial solvents, oils, and chemicals. That's not an estimate. That's the number Racer Trust uses in environmental reports filed with federal and state agencies. 4.1 million gallons is roughly the volume of 6 Olympic swimming pools filled with transmission oil, trichloroethylene, benzene, and solvents, poured into the ground beneath a factory the size of a small city. The contamination sits under approximately 40 acres of the 83-acre plant footprint. That's half the site. In some areas, it extends 60 feet below the surface, deep enough that it's entered the regional aquifer that supplies drinking water to wells north of the site. Those wells aren't contaminated yet, according to quarterly monitoring reports. Yet. The operative word. Contamination migrates at rates measured in fractions of inches per year. The clay soils slow the migration but don't stop it. Over decades, over centuries, the contamination will reach those wells unless something intervenes. The federal bankruptcy court established Racer Trust, revitalizing auto community's environmental response in March 2011 to manage and liquidate 66 properties GM abandoned across 14 states. Willow Run was the largest and most contaminated site in Michigan. The settlement allocated $35.8 million for environmental cleanup at Willow Run alone, more than any other site in the trust's portfolio. Grant Trigger, the professional engineer and environmental attorney hired as cleanup manager, estimated publicly that the contamination would take tens of years to address. That was optimistic phrasing for what the trust's internal documents make clear. The contamination will be managed indefinitely, potentially for centuries. The plan Racer implemented involves multiple strategies. In 2016, they installed a French drain groundwater collection system, a network of perforated pipes buried in gravel trenches designed to intercept contaminated groundwater before it migrates off-site. The system pulls water out of the ground and routes it to a treatment facility, then discharges treated water through a sanitary sewer. The system captures thousands of gallons daily. It's not enough to capture everything, but it's enough to slow the spread. In 2017, Racer bulkheaded the existing stormwater conveyances, the pipes Ford installed in 1941 to manage rain runoff. Those pipes had been carrying contaminated groundwater into Willow Run Creek for decades. Closing those pipes stopped direct discharge into surface water. Racer also constructed engineered wetlands to treat some of the collected water using plant species that metabolize petroleum hydrocarbons and certain solvents. The wetlands reduce contamination concentrations in water that passes through them to levels acceptable for discharge, which are still detectable but below thresholds that trigger regulatory action. It's better than nothing. It's not clean. PFAS contamination, detected in groundwater samples in 2019, adds another layer of chemical permanence. Per- and polyfluoroalkyl substances, forever chemicals, compounds so stable they don't break down in human timescales. The only treatment options are expensive filtration systems that remove PFAS from water, concentrated into waste that still needs disposal somewhere, and require ongoing maintenance forever. Racer identified PFAS in May 2019 during routine sampling. The concentrations weren't immediately dangerous according to EPA thresholds that existed then, thresholds that have since been revised downward. Racer filed reports. The state held a public meeting in June 2019. Residents asked questions that had no good answers. How long has this been here? Nobody knows. Where did it come from? Manufacturing processes, probably. But which ones and when? Will it reach drinking water wells? Not yet. Racer continues to evaluate remedial treatment alternatives for PFAS contamination. Evaluation is code for "we don't know what to do." The quarterly reports document the evaluation process. The contamination persists. Demolition began December 2013. Crews tore down 5 million square feet over 18 months. Only 145,000 square feet survived. The Yankee Air Museum raised money to save the section with the hangar doors where B-24s first rolled onto the runway. The museum opened in 2015 with exhibits documenting Willow Run's history. It's a respectful memorial. It tells the story the way museums tell stories: heroic, necessary, triumphant. The American Center for Mobility opened in April 2017, a 500-acre proving ground for autonomous vehicles. Michigan invested $67 million. The vision was to position Michigan at the forefront of autonomous vehicle technology, create thousands of jobs. 7 companies paid $5 million each to be founding members: Toyota, Visteon, Honda, Ford, BMW, Qualcomm. Supporting member Subaru paid $2 million. The projections were wrong. The autonomous vehicle industry hit turbulence in 2018. Companies pushed timelines from 2020 to 2030. Testing demand didn't increase as predicted. Leadership turned over. CEO John Maddox departed August 2018. CTO Andrew Smart left April 2018. COO Laurel Champion exited June 2018. The state approved $35 million in 2018 as a loan. By 2024, the center couldn't make payments. The state forgave $15 million in earlier loan. The $35 million loan entered default. The state allocated another $2 million for infrastructure. Ypsilanti Township granted a Renaissance Zone designation, eliminating taxes until 2031. Total public investment exceeds $67 million. Early projections suggested 2,000 jobs by 2025. Current employment is fewer than 50. The companies that test bring their own engineers who stay in hotels and leave. The economic impact is minimal. The question nobody in state government wants to answer publicly is whether to continue investing or cut losses. Another 50 million might stabilize the center, assuming demand increases, or the state could force bankruptcy and reclaim the land. That option is politically toxic because it means admitting 67 million was wasted. So the state continues investing incrementally, hoping the center survives long enough for the industry to recover and justify the investment retroactively. It's the same logic that drove Willow Run originally. Invest massively based on promises about the future, then hope the future arrives before the bills come due. The center continues operating, hosting events that generate press releases but not profit. In November 2024, they opened the EV Charging Base Camp. In October 2024, they hosted a Vehicle-to-Grid conference. In September 2024, Michigan Tech partnered on engineering services. Progress, innovation, the future. The same words, repackaged. The same promise. What remains uncertain is whether the center will survive 5 years. The debt load is manageable only if revenue increases significantly. The state has invested too much to walk away, but continuing to invest requires justifying every dollar to taxpayers. Who pays when the promise breaks? The workers paid in the 1940s when jobs disappeared. Ypsilanti paid when GM closed and the tax base collapsed. The state pays now, pouring millions into a test track that may never generate returns. The pattern holds across 80 years. The promise is always the same. The cost is always carried by someone who can't afford to say no. What remains now is a question of accounting. Ford built the bombers, collected contracts, walked away without buying the plant. The workers were expendable. The government built Bomber City, then sold it off. Kaiser Frazer arrived, extracted value, left for Ohio. GM ran transmissions for 60 years, filed bankruptcy, left the contamination. The trust allocated $35.8 million, knowing it wouldn't be enough. Michigan invested $67 million in a mobility center that can't make loan payments. The profit went to Detroit. The cost stayed in Ypsilanti. Ford received $200 million in federal contracts at cost plus markup. GM generated billions over 60 years and walked away from cleanup through bankruptcy. The state invested millions in a test track that may not survive the decade. Ypsilanti lost $5.4 million per year in property taxes and granted more tax breaks. The workers got paychecks that ended when production did. The contamination will outlast everyone. 4.1 million gallons don't disappear. French drains slow the migration, treat what they capture. The aquifer remains compromised. Drinking wells are monitored but not yet affected. PFAS continues to migrate. Racer files quarterly reports. The cleanup budget was set for 100 years. Willow Run was sold as a miracle of American manufacturing. Charles Lindbergh called it the Grand Canyon of the mechanized world. The press reported it as proof that American ingenuity could accomplish anything. 42,000 workers believed they were building the future. The reality was harder. The workers built the planes. The planes won the war. The workers went home, except those who didn't have homes. Those who stayed cycled through Kaiser Frazer, GM, layoffs, nothing. The factory became a relic, then a liability, then a test track funded by taxpayers who will never use it. The question isn't whether Willow Run mattered. It did. 8,685 bombers mattered. The question is who bore the cost and who collected the value. The bombers are gone. Most went to war. 4 surviving B-24s built at Willow Run still fly at air shows. The rest are dust. The workers are gone, or old, or forgotten. The factory is demolished, buried under test track asphalt. The contamination remains. There's a small museum in the corner of what used to be the bomber plant. Visitors can see the hangar doors, imagine the noise, picture the scale. It tells the story the way stories should be told: heroic, necessary, triumphant. It doesn't talk much about the housing crisis, labor strife, environmental contamination, or the fact that the people who built the planes were used up and replaced as efficiently as the aluminum they riveted. History remembers Willow Run as a miracle. Engineering students study the assembly line. Business schools teach the production method. Military historians calculate missions and bombs. All of that is true. None of it is complete. What's also true is that 42,000 people worked in conditions that broke bodies and lives, housed in temporary structures that became permanent, paid wages that covered rent but not much more, told their work was patriotic while profits flowed elsewhere. When the war ended, workers were discarded faster than defective parts, their seniority erased, their housing sold off, their labor obsolete. GM ran that plant for 60 years, generated billions, left a contamination bill larger than the cleanup budget and longer than human life expectancy. The American Center for Mobility represents a different promise now. Self-driving cars, the future of transportation. The state poured $67 million into that promise and forgave loans when returns didn't materialize. It's approving ground testing technologies for companies that build vehicles elsewhere, researching solutions that may never reach production. The pattern holds. Investment concentrates risk in one place. When the risk manifests, the community absorbs the cost. Detroit got the profit, Ypsilanti got the land, the debt, the poison. Willow Run was called the arsenal of democracy, the factory that proved America could outproduce any enemy. That's true. It's also true that democracies calculate costs differently for different people. Some pay in labor and risk, some collect in profit and walk away. When the war ended, Ford and GM collected. The workers and Ypsilanti paid. The contamination is still paying. There's a metal plaque commemorating Dedication Day, June 16, 1941. It lists dignitaries, contractors, architects. It doesn't list the workers, the families in Bomber City, the people who stayed after everyone left. Memory is selective. It remembers the grand opening, not the slow closing. The first plane rolling off the line, not the last worker walking out. The miracle, not the cost. Those numbers don't fit on a plaque. They don't fit in a museum. They don't fit into the story we tell about how we won the war and built the future. But they're the numbers that matter if you're trying to understand who paid and who didn't. The bombers are gone. The workers are gone. The factory is mostly gone. What remains is what always remains when industrial promises break. Land too contaminated to use, debts too large to pay, and a community left holding both while profits disappear into corporate structures designed to outlive liability. The test track is smooth. The mobility center looks modern. Progress, innovation, the future. The same words, repackaged. The same promise, invest now, collect later. The same arithmetic. Risk concentrates in one place, returns distribute elsewhere. Somewhere under that test track, 60 feet below the pavement, contamination spreads at fractions of inches per year. The French drains collect what they can. The engineered wetlands treat what they catch. The rest migrates, persists. Racer files quarterly reports. The PFAS levels fluctuate within acceptable ranges. The monitoring continues. The cleanup continues. The cost continues. If you visit the Yankee Air Museum, a guide will tell you about the assembly line, the turntables, the pace that produced one plane every 63 minutes. They'll show you photographs of women riveting, men installing engines, bombers lined up on the runway. They'll tell you about Rosie the Riveter, the arsenal of democracy, the miracle of American manufacturing. What they might not tell you is that workers were paid 85 cents an hour and housed in dormitories designed to last 5 years. That housing was segregated until activists forced integration. That Henry Ford resisted hiring women until the draft left no choice. That turnover was so brutal Ford hired 2,900 and lost 3,100 in 1 month. That the plant closed and left workers stranded. That when GM took over, former bomber workers lost seniority. That GM ran transmissions for 60 years, filed bankruptcy, walked away from contamination that will outlast everyone reading this. That's not a good story. That's an accounting problem. But it's also true. The question that opened this was whether Willow Run was the arsenal of democracy or an assembly line of disposable labor. The answer is both. It was the factory that proved America could win wars through industrial capacity. It was also the place where 42,000 people learned that labor is expendable and promises expire when production ends. Both things are true. History prefers the first story, but the second explains the contamination, the debt, the cleanup plan that stretches beyond lifetimes. What remains now is a test track built on poisoned ground, funded by taxpayers, operated by a nonprofit that can't pay its loans, testing technologies for companies that build elsewhere. The risk stays local. The profit goes somewhere else. The cost lingers longer than anyone planned. 75 years ago, this place built the planes that helped win World War II. Today, it tests cars that drive themselves. In another 75 years, maybe the contamination will be remediated or managed or forgotten. The aquifer will remember. The soil will remember. The question was, who pays when the promise breaks? The answer is still being calculated. One quarterly report at a time, one defaulted loan at a time, 1 century of cleanup at a time. Some costs get paid forward. Some get paid back. Most just get carried, indefinitely, by whoever stays when everyone else leaves. That's not how the story was supposed to end, but it's how this one does.